So I thought it would make sense to start by mapping out this ideological conflict. This is something I've never seen done anywhere, but it's also everywhere in the sense that I've never seen it mapped out before. But I think that we can always benefit from understanding this map. And like all maps are limited, right? Like all maps are useful to a point. All maps are helpful, and then they become unhelpful if because of course all maps sort of miss levels of some nuance, which is understood. But we're going to outline just 4 positions. We'll call them 1, 2, 3, and 4. So position number 1 is the position of an expansive. We'll call it expansive Zionism. I mean, all these names we can play with and rework as we go. But an expansive Zionist perspective is the perspective basically that I grew up in, which is from the river to the sea, a Jewish homeland. Okay, and we have a Palestinian problem. We have a problem of Palestinians who are in that area. This, of course, is parallel to like the Jewish problem that exists in Europe. We have like Jews in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. What do we do about that? That has to be solved somehow. But in principle, this ideology is that Jewish hegemony over all of broader Israel from the river to the sea is the goal. Okay, a second version is two-state Zionism, right? This is category number 2, and this is the position that says the just solution is 2 states. It says that the current occupation of the Palestinians is unjust. There are criticisms within 2-state Zionism for a lot of decisions that the right-wing Netanyahu governments have made, and criticism of the occupation which started in 1967 after the Six-Day War, criticisms of settler violence. But ultimately, the only solution available within this line of thinking is a 2-state solution. You need a Palestinian state and an Israeli state side by side. The idea is two fences make good neighbors. Now, all this is on one side of a divide here, right? All this belongs on one side of this divide. Maybe we'll change these colors to blue. Okay, this is the Zionist side, right? So over here takes you, this is the pro-Israel side. You can be pro-Israel if you hold either of these 2 views. Okay, this is the pro-Israel side of things. Expansive Zionism is the world I grew up in. It characterizes Netanyahu's government. I like to think of it as like a Lebensraum kind of Zionism, this idea of we need more space, and who cares what happens to the people who live there. It's very ideologically driven by religious, are appealing to our religious texts. 2-state Zionism is this liberal Zionism. It's a Zionism which characterizes like the American Democratic Party, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, and beyond. It's the face of Zionism that you'll hear from the academics, Israeli academics especially, and we'll talk more about that. How do I make this text bigger? This is the pro-Israel side. Now, there's also a pro-Palestinian side, which is quite a symmetrical arrangement here, right? So we'll call it pro-Palestinian. Maybe we'll make this green. Okay, so the third option is binational 1, binational state. Okay. You could obviously imagine pro-Palestinians who are 2-state Zionism. And of course, always we're massaging over and ignoring many details, of course. And if there have been historically, and you can imagine, again, a pro-Palestinian argument for 2 states. But practically speaking, if you read, like I've read, just the small sampling of texts that are written from the academic pro-Palestinian perspective, in general, what you're looking at is a belief in a one binational state where Jews and Palestinians coexist. This is considered, anti-Zionism in general. And then, of course, the fourth category, which we would characterize, let's say, the Hamas's charter or whatever, is a one Palestinian, one Palestinian state, which means no Jews, basically, right? Jews aren't welcome here. They're at risk of, they wouldn't be full citizens, at least. Maybe they would be welcome, right? Maybe Jews could be but it's certainly a state without a binational identity, right? No binational say one Palestinian state. There's no binational identity here. That's the key thing. And this is considered the extremist pro-Palestinian position. So these four things exist, right? So expansive Zionism is sort of like the Trumpian Zionism. So Netanyahu is in many ways very, very different from Trump, of course, but he has a lot of the same illiberal instincts. He's an obvious narcissist. He's currently embattled because he's trying to take down undermine the judiciary in Israel, which plays a what's the word I'm looking for, like a tempering role, it restrains a lot of the abuses. Okay. Imagination Scene asks, what about polling? Yeah, polling is a key question, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit. I'm not going to pull up specific numbers. I have some intuitions about it, which my intuitions don't really matter. You can all look up polling. Everyone can look up polling on these questions. It's very interesting. And they're also very sensitive, right? They're very sensitive to the way in which the questions are asked. And so, I don't want to get too bogged down in the weeds of the exact percentages, right? It seems to me that two-state Zionism used to be the sort of the mainstream view in Israel until the Rabin assassination. Two-state Zionism was, the peace process that Yitzhak Rabin was engaged in, and he was assassinated by Yigal Amir in the early 90s, I believe, and that really derailed two-state Zionism. With the Oslo Accords, which were happening at the same time, in the aftermath of that, there was a sense that two-state Zionism failed. And once expansive Zionism became ascendant in Israeli society. So this is like the Trumpian kind of view within Israel. And there's a lot of, and I say that because in the Jewish world and where I live, the overlap between like this expansive Zionism and like support for Trump in America among American Zionists is feels like almost one-to-one, right? There's like a huge amount of overlap. And again, the two-state Zionism, like I said, is like the mainstream Democratic position. This is like Hillary Clinton, who wrote an article in The Atlantic saying we shouldn't have a ceasefire. She supports two states. And then, one binational state. I don't know. You guys can look up polling. I think polling is an interesting question, but it's not really relevant to this particular live stream. The thing is, people also exist in superpositions, right? People aren't limited to one ideological perspective. So I think for many Palestinians, they exist here in category 3 and 4, which means their goal they're in a tug of war, and they're trying to move the Overton window, and if the people just want to live sort of life of flourishing and a life of well-being and subject to the rule of law, and they'll take whatever they can get. If they think a two-state solution is viable, then they would be open to that. If they thought a binational state was viable, they'd be open to that. And if they don't think those things are viable, which would be the message they would get after decades and decades of domination, decades of settlement expansion, then they'll be here. But if things change, again, people are fluid, and people can exist in a superposition, meaning they can have a first choice and a second choice. They can sort of be in two camps at the same time. And I think that's really important to understand. And I certainly know that experience. I know what it's like to be in camp number 1, and then in camp number 2, and also to have been in camp 1 and 2, and then to be maybe in camp 2 and 3, So I think that's really important as well. There's some more to say about this map. What's interesting to me about this map is the way in which the position in which people fall into these 4 categories depends on the polling, right? Imagination Scene asked about the polling. What about the polling, right? It depends on the polling, right? Meaning where I fall as a pro-Israel Zionist, right? This is Zionist versus anti-Zionist. Where I fall depends on where I think the Palestinians fall. So you get like this sort of prisoner's dilemma, where my choice depends on their choice. If I believe that the mainstream position among Palestinians is one Palestinian state, then I am not interested in two-state Zionism. I will be pushed into expansive Zionism, right? I think that's crucial to understand. And that's especially salient in this world of social media, where in our sort of media bubble, certain voices get amplified. It's certainly relevant in understanding how Israel is going to feel when it's in a war with Hamas, whose charter is certainly one Palestinian state with no legitimacy to an Israeli presence, a Jewish presence in the land at all. Now, this two-state Zionism, this liberal Zionism, is characterized by, for example, I would say the elites, right? Meaning people who have more, who are not Trumpian. People have more of an understanding of real history. People who are less ideologically motivated. And so an example of that is the former heads of the Shin Bet. And I did 3 videos on my channel about a book by Ami Ayalon, former head of the Shin Bet, Friendly Fire. The third video was about his role in the documentary The Gatekeepers, which is a documentary with all the former heads of the Shin Bet. And these are people whose job it is to ensure security for the state of Israel, right? Their job is to infiltrate, Palestinian society and surveil Palestinian society and try to negotiate and talk to Palestinians on the ground and try to secure safety for the Israeli citizens. And they come to the conclusion that expansive Zionism is a disaster. Expansive Zionism is cruel and oppressive, and it causes terrorism. And they come to the conclusion that two-state Zionism is possible, right? Meaning they're coming to the conclusion that this one Palestinian state, although it might exist, it might show up in the polling, you might be able to find it, is not decisive. People can be moved, right? People can be moved. So we have a comment here. I read 30-something% and 20-something% for Israelis and Palestinians respectively, but I think that was pre-war and has fallen on both sides. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. Those are similar to numbers I think I've seen. And so now if I were to chart my own evolution, right? So I grew up in this expansive Zionist worldview, very motivated by religious texts and religious thinking. And then I found oh my God, to the former heads of the Shin Bet, people who actually know Palestinians, people are actually involved in Israeli security, expansive Zionism is an outrage. Expansive Zionism is like Lebensraum Zionism, right? It's like to quote Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who's someone who was a harsh critic, an academic in Israel, and a harsh critic of the occupation starting in 1968, right after the Six-Day War. He calls that these Judeo-Nazis who are just trying to conquer people and oppress people, right? And that was a shock to me to learn this, because that was not part of my original, thinking. Within Israel, you have this sort of more dominant view and a less dominant view. But this dividing line is very powerful. Right? There is a mainstream, even within the elites in Israel. There seems to be, even within the pro-Israel academic camp and historian camp, a strong assumption that coexistence is not possible. Okay? Because the one binational state, category 3 is coexistence. Okay? So within Israel and within the Zionist world, even, right, this is how far as you can go and still be a Zionist. You can go up to this line and still be a Zionist. Once you cross this line, you're no longer a Zionist. And in the Jewish world, you risk a certain level of being ostracized, right? You're no longer welcome in certain Orthodox communities, for example. If you say one binational state, you're saying you believe that there is a legitimate pro-Palestinian movement that should be engaged with. You're saying that you believe that there's a liberation politics that are urgent, that you are aligned now with the Palestinian marches around the world, because I believe that this is the mainstream modern what's the word I'm looking for, like a progressive view, and the reason is because two-state Zionism has proven itself over decades to be sort of a mirage, a facade, right? So let's look at an example of this, right? Why is two-state Zionism so dead? Because this is the dream. The dream is, after 1967, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and shortly afterwards it gave it back to Egypt in exchange for peace with Egypt. And academics and elites at the time in Israeli society made the case that Israel needs to do exactly the same thing with the West Bank, return it to Jordan and make peace with Jordan. And then you would have a two-state kind of Zionism. You'd have or potentially a Palestinian state or Jordanian state for the Palestinians to live, and that would be a resolution to the conflict. This has died to a large extent. And let's talk about why that is. Okay? So there is a New Yorker article, which is really, really important here. This New Yorker article. The maps of Israeli settlements that shocked Barack Obama from 2018. Okay? Since 1967, the settlements have been expanding in the West Bank. And what that amounts to is this promise that Israeli government and the Zionist community has made to the world that we will eventually settle on a two-state solution was proven to sort of be a lie. Because there is no two states that you can draw. And in 2018, okay, Barack Obama has been president for a long time, 6 years if my math is correct. He was shocked to learn this. And what ends up happening in this article is there was a famous moment towards the end of Obama's presidency where the U.S. failed to veto a UN resolution condemning Israel settlement building. And Netanyahu and the Zionist world took this as a huge betrayal from Barack Obama, and they still, hold a grudge against him for it. But the reason is because he sort of saw through this propaganda technique. He saw that there is no two-state solution. No one in the Israeli side believes in a two-state or is working for a two-state, and there's no way it can happen because how could you possibly draw a border with a second independent Palestinian state now if you have 60 years of unrestricted settlement expansion? Okay. The two-state Zionism camp is very interesting to me. So we have a question here. Best would be a confederation of Israel and Palestine. Maybe. Yeah, maybe, Daniel. Yeah. Of course, as I mentioned before, this is a very, very rough outline of a spectrum of much more complex and nuanced positions. The key thing here, though, that I think is pretty much unquestionable is the way in which Zionism ends at the end of two-state Zionism. If you think that justice for Palestinians is a kind of coexistence, a liberation where they're not living under occupation, and I don't know, you don't. It's more than just two states. Then you're outside of the pro-Israel Zionist camp. And so there are lots of really smart, really brilliant academics and in Israel who are so critical of expansive Zionism and see no hope for two-state Zionism. And they're just sort of lost, right? Like as Imagination Scene just commented, it looks so broken, right? They just feel this deep sense of brokenness. In America, in the West, the progressive politics of liberation say that there's a crisis on the ground for Palestinians. Palestinians are living in an unjust situation, and they need to be liberated from that. And the most sensible way that remains is a kind of a binational, give them citizenship, right? It just means give them citizenship. So basically, if someone says Israel's an apartheid state, that's a huge controversy. Zionists would never accept that label. What does that mean? They're saying that the resolution to the conflict needs to be the resolution that happened in apartheid South Africa, where you had a minority of whites ruling over a majority of African blacks, and the resolution is to end apartheid and give them citizenship, give them enfranchisement, make them voters, right? That's what calling Israel an apartheid state means, basically. It means that these are people who need to be liberated, who need to be enfranchised, who need to be brought into Israel, right? Israel already has a population of 2 million Palestinians who are full citizens. So that recipe has happened, right? At the end of the 6-Day War, and the end of the 48 War, actually. At the end of the War of 1948, Israel found itself, again, ruling over millions of Palestinians, and it eventually enfranchised those Palestinians. So that as a template for resolving this crisis is available to us. But on the pro-Israel side, that's basically seen as unacceptable. Of course, there are Israelis who believe in a one binational state. And often, it's a small percentage, but often those Israelis are the Israelis who know the most Palestinians, right? Like the Israelis who have the most contact and experience working directly with Palestinians often feel that actually we can coexist. So that is the layout of the land. And that's sort of what this move is. And so sort of what I want to communicate and what I want to describe is a trajectory. I want to describe a trajectory. So the trajectory is from here to here to like here, right? The question is, do you cross this line? Right? If you grow up in the Zionist world and you sort of become repulsed by the expansive Zionist, this only our land, the Bible says it's our land, and you sort of learn from the two-state Zionism that this is a pretty obscene way of engaging in the modern world and treating people, and the outcome of that is atrocious and inhumane and oppressive. Do you end up here and just say like, the boat has left? We missed the boat, basically. We could have given them a two states after the 1967 war. We chose not to, and now we're just in a death spiral. we're just locked in this perpetual conflict? Or do you go further than that and say, no, like actually there's a real legitimate Palestinian liberation movement which is worth engaging with? That is the question. For two states, would there need to be a peaceful land? That's a great question. All right, so imagination is asking, these are the questions. These are the questions. So again, to sort of pick up on what you're saying, imagination scene, right? There are two-state Zionists who believe in it still, right? And they say we can make it work. We'll make it work with non-contiguous land, right? Because that's also part of the problem. Gaza and the West Bank are not contiguous. The Palestinian sense of national identity includes Gaza and the West Bank. Israel, I think, worked very hard to specifically make sure that Gaza and the West Bank are governed by different governments, because part of Israel's goal in terms of promoting expansive Zionism is to balkanize and split up the Palestinians, right? So can a balkanized Palestinian state exist? A state where there's, Israeli settlements and roads that, maybe are binationally controlled or something? So there are people who are fighting for that, right? People who are saying yes. And I think Ami Ayalon, who's the author that I've talked about, whose books I've covered on my channel, Friendly Fire, like he's fighting for two states. He still seems to believe. He makes social media posts, the only way to defeat Hamas is a two-state solution, right? And so he would, if we had him for an interview, and he does interviews, by the way. I mean, I probably have no more appetite for these kind of interviews and discussions going forward for a while at least. But I mean, I'm sure there'd at least be a chance I could talk to him if I made an effort. He seems very generous with his time. He would say, let's just do a balkanized, discontinuous Palestinian state or something. We'll do land swaps. They say land swaps, right? Or again, draw a fancy border. Maybe. But I think mainstream, progressive, and Palestinian perspective is that it's a fantasy. Right? I mean, mainstream, you ask yourself, would you accept it? Would Israelis accept it? Would Israelis accept a state that was carved out like Swiss cheese or something with they had to drive around Palestinian villages and that was their state? I don't know. I can only speak, Daniel, I think of and I speak to American political landscape. In American politics, you have the Trump party, which, moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the American embassy to Jerusalem, signaling this endorsement of expansive Zionism, and has sort of given the green light on settlement expansion. And then you have the Democratic Party, which wants to rein in settlement expansion, but is stridently two-state. And I think you have a growing progressive party, people like Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders, who are not really believing in two-state Zionism anymore. And they think of a Palestinian liberation, which is going to look different than two states. So does it enjoy more international support? Yeah. But that might be changing, is what I'm suggesting. The other piece, though, before we even move on a little bit to my education, is the way in which these two play off each other in a really complicated, interesting, and important way. If you read this history, if you read the politics, if you read the discussions, what happens is that two-state Zionism gives cover, gives legitimacy to expansive Zionism. Okay? This has been ongoing, and I feel complicit in this, right? As a liberal Zionist, right? As someone who makes the case for Israel as a democracy, striving for two states and a just, equitable partition with the Palestinians. What has happened historically is that rhetoric has bought international support to Israel, has bought legitimacy to Israeli governments, which they've been used to expand settlements. Right? Again, that's what happened when Obama sort of in 2018, which critics might say was very, very, very late, came to this realization that there really is no two-state solution, that Israel is not in good faith working towards two states. And you could blame the government, but the government in Israel is a reflection of the people. And for all sorts of reasons related to terror, related to trauma, related to the shadow of the Holocaust, related to just the deep segregation in Israeli society, Israel has no appetite for two states. And so the government of Israel, which again, people criticize and is worthy of criticism, is a reflection of the Israeli society at large. Comment here. The demographics for more religious groups growing in Israel play a part in the moving away from two-state, or is that too simplistic? It depends who you ask. I mean, I think that plays a part. The argument that it's simplistic is the argument that these things, I think people mostly respond to their incentives, right? I think citizens, people mostly are responsive to incentives. And so I think it's true. I think that's accurate. I don't think that's too simplistic. But the nuance there is that I think I've seen with my own eyes. I've seen with my own eyes. I can't show you these videos because these videos were up temporarily and they were taken down. They're no longer available for public consumption. But meetings between Palestinians and Israelis that were recorded, and again, who knows where these videos are now? They're not publicly available. Meetings, Palestinians and Israelis, where you have right-wing Israelis sitting down with Palestinians to talk peace, right? An organization that did this at the time was Minds for Peace. This is many, many years ago. And right-wing, expansive Zionist Israelis can quickly be moved to two states when they sit down with Palestinians, right? So that's the sense in which it's overly simplistic. The sense in which it's overly simplistic is the sense in which the entire map of 1, 2, 3, 4 categories is overly simplistic because people are fluid. And given the right incentives and given the right information and given the right interpersonal human contact, people can quickly shift between those categories. But I would also say, yes, demographics are definitely playing a role. Religious groups have way more children in Israel. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it's too simplistic, but I would say that people are fluid. So it's complicated. Okay. And so to situate him in our map, right? So Benny Morris is a huge opponent of the settlements. Benny Morris, as a soldier, refused to serve in the settlements. Benny Morris, believes that the right wing religious Zionist project is like ruining the state of Israel. It's highly oppressive and awful for the Palestinians. But he is staunchly against coexistence, right? He ends at two states. He's in this despondent position where he thinks Israel has been awful to the Palestinians, that the settlements are stealing Palestinian land, are destroying any chance of a two-state solution. But he thinks there's no chance of coexistence. And so it's interesting to ask yourself, as an American, as a spectator, what's going on. Is he right or left? It's an interesting question. He's squarely Zionistic. He's squarely in the pro-Israel side. And he's certainly to the right of a lot of progressive voices today. He's certainly to the right of the pro-Palestinian liberation marches. But he's a staunch critic of right-wing Zionism. But if you're a right-wing Zionist, it's very useful. It's very useful to point to Benny Morris and say, even Benny Morris, who's a brilliant historian, who has all sorts of criticisms of Israel, will tell you we cannot coexist. And if you internalize that we cannot coexist, if you read a lot of Benny Morris and you really internalize that coexistence is impossible, it doesn't matter how much oppression there is, all you're left with is expansive Zionism, right? So it seems. So Benny Morris is in this very complicated position that a lot of people find themselves in, I think. Where I, to some extent, am wrestling with, right? I'm making this live stream to wrestle with this, right? Am I Benny Morris, so to speak? Or has he not gone far enough? That's sort of the key question. Is that sufficient? Imagination Scene asked, did his views change after the Second Intifada? I think so. I'm not sure. I think that question came up. I think so. I think a lot of Israelis, views changed. His narrative is a very common Israeli narrative that we tried two states with Oslo and Rabin, and it failed. And for whatever reasons, he believes staunchly that coexistence is not possible. So yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I have my answer. My answer is a little dangerous because if I say my answer, I risk ostracizing myself from certain political or social networks that I'm currently embedded in. I want to share with you Lincolnia. Do you guys know about Lincolnia? Lincolnia was the name of a proposed Central American colony suggested by Republican Senator Samuel Pomeroy of Kansas in 1862. Since his early political career, Abraham Lincoln had supported the American Colonialization Society, a controversial group whose goal was the removal of free blacks from the United States. Right? It and its state affiliates, starting in the 1820s, began settlements in West Africa and would eventually unite to form Liberia. Similarly to Lincolnia. All right. Lincoln desired, at this point in his political career, to return former slaves to Africa or other tropical regions with their consent and the accord of the authorities of the country where they were to be settled. He repeated his support for colonization numerous times, including during the American Civil War. We don't remember this part of American history, right? For the most part. We think of Lincoln as the man who freed the slaves, and then with the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, I believe, ended slavery. 14th Amendment, I believe, gave them enfranchisement, gave the former slaves the right to vote. But it wasn't that simple. So for most of Lincoln's political career, and for much of America at the time, this of course being a mirror reflecting American society, there was an increasing awareness of the horror of slavery. Slavery is oppressive. Slavery is bad. But there was an assumption that coexistence is not possible, right? There was an assumption that America could not survive coexistence. And so what do? So the assumption was the only thing you could do is basically a generous ethnic cleansing, get them to move out. I see in here a parallel to sort of the current situation in Israel, where there can be an awareness of the horror of expansive Zionism, the oppressiveness of indefinite occupation, the way in which that fuels terrorism and extremism on both sides, and just creates all sorts of death, but a staunch belief that coexistence is not possible. And if anyone thinks, well, blacks and Arabs or blacks and Muslims are different or something, I mean, that is like a really ahistorical perspective, because the reason we think blacks can coexist is because they coexist, right? Like, meaning at the time when this was happening, there was no paradigm of coexistence. So coexistence seemed impossible. And then coexistence was proven to be possible. And so, again, similarly, if you feel there's no paradigm for coexistence, that's exactly parallel to the kind of political anxieties that were felt at that time. Similarly, the same arguments, the same anxieties were around in apartheid South Africa. How can blacks and whites coexist? And America and South Africa both struggle with coexistence, right? America and South Africa are not utopias, obviously. This goes without saying. But I think most modern people would agree that America and South Africa made the right decision by working in the direction of coexistence.